Ahmed Aziz's Epic Year, chapters 22 and 23. Chapter 22. Dad was doing okay the first day after surgery, as expected, Mom said. She left for the hospital before I woke up, arranging rides for Sarah and me to get to school. My ride was Jack's mom. "Good morning, Mrs. Hanson," I said, but she didn't look my way. She put her index finger in the air, asking me to wait. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to wait to get in the car or just to speak. Jack wasn't going to help me figure it out. I hesitated before getting into the back seat. Neither turned around to acknowledge my presence before backing out of the driveway. "I can't be there for another 2 days," Mrs. Hanson said into the phone that was stuck on a magnet on her AC vent. "I need to find someone to watch my son, but I'll be there as soon as I can." She hung up the phone and looked at me through her rearview mirror, flashing a huge smile. "Why, hello, you must be Ahmed. Glad to meet you." I waved weakly into the mirror. "So what takes you boy into school early today?" Jack started to explain. "Well, we have this teacher, Mrs. Garter, and we get graded on participation, so our group is meeting early to go over our notes." "Mm-hmm. What about you, Ahmed? Your mom mentioned you moved from Alaska?" "Hawaii," I said. "Mm-hmm. You missed the turn for school, Mom." "Oh, shoot. I meant to turn on the GPS after I was done with the phone call." "Mrs. Garter's class has this competition every year, and no one has ever beaten her. We're going to try this year." I had never heard Jack sound so eager. Mrs. Hanson punched some things into her phone, one hand on the steering wheel. Mom would not have approved. "That's nice, dear. She makes us read 3 children's books and talk about them like they're adult books." The phone rang again, and she answered it, steering with one hand again. Okay. I know it's important," she said. "What do you want me to do? Leave him home alone?" There was a long pause while she listened. "Because it's against the law." Jack didn't try to speak to her for the rest of the ride, and with all her wrong turns, we got to school just in time for the bell. Jessica would be furious. I wanted to say something to Jack about how my mom gets distracted too, but Mom never ignored me. About how sometimes my mom needed to dump me on someone else. But it wasn't true. The car pulled away. "What are you looking at?" I hadn't realized I was looking, and then he growled, seriously, like an animal. Not like an animal on the attack, but like a wounded animal. He knocked my backpack to the ground. I picked it up, and feeling sorry for him was replaced with feeling sorry for myself again. Chapter 23. With one semi-successful semi-presentation under my belt from the last class, I felt good. We had visited Dad at the hospital the night before. He was weak and didn't open his eyes for us, but I still told him about my first presentation. He would have gotten a kick out of seeing me try. This must be what the school counselors were hoping I'd feel when they talked about helping me live up to my potential. I liked it, but wasn't convinced it justified the work. Mostly, I was relieved my turn to lead the discussion was officially over, and someone else could sweat it out. A few years ago, Mom agreed to let me quit piano, but only if I played Beethoven's Für Elise perfectly at a recital. I practiced for months, motivated by the possibility of quitting. All that practice paid off, and I didn't make a single mistake. A woman in the front row wiped away tears, and I got the first and most likely only standing ovation of my life. Mom hoped the experience would stop me from quitting. Of course, she was wrong. One very intense school counselor, whose daughter was also performing at the recital, called me a caterpillar, making a beautiful change. A metamorphosis. Of course, she was wrong too. I wasn't the metamorphosis type. An overachieving girl, a boy so polite you hated to disappoint him, and fear of physical harm from a bully were not enough to change me into a butterfly. "Hope everyone's preparing notes and keeping track of the characters," Mrs. Garter said, pointing to Carl. "Carl showed me this feature on Connect that makes it easy to keep everything straight. It'll be helpful for the essays. Ask him about it if you have questions." She tilted her head toward Carl, who wasn't at all embarrassed about being called out that way. By the end of the year, it's sometimes hard to remember the details. Here's a tip. Winning the trophy is in the details. Not that any of you would know. Mrs. Garter smiled as she nodded at the trophy. It hasn't moved from that spot on my desk in all these years, after all. She looked around the room. The floor is all yours, Carl. He walked to the front, holding index cards of different colors, back straight and shoulders back like he was ready for anything. He picked up the trophy and pretended to put it in his pocket. The class laughed, and so did I. I'm pretty sure I looked nothing like that when I was up there. If you look carefully, you might still see the stain from my puddle of sweat, forever marking the spot where I stood. He shuffled through his index cards, pulled out the yellow ones, and put the rest in his back pocket. For another day, I guess. Our group decided to continue the discussions we had last week. When I reviewed the recordings of our group discussions on my phone, wait, did he say recordings? Jessica shot me a dirty look. Ari made a gesture to indicate next time, and Jack kicked my seat. I noted something, Carl continued, oblivious to the problems he had created for me. What interested each person in our group was not the themes of the book or the plot, but the characters. Even more interesting was that without planning or assigning it, each of us had a different favorite character. I watched Carl's face as he spoke. The same face that looked like it would cry at the mere mention of an assignment not done looked calm and comfortable, like he belonged there. We weren't different, we were polar opposites. We were all reading the same thing, he continued, but we each rooted for a different person. Sure, the bad guys were still the bad guys, and the good guys were still the good guys, but beyond that, we each noticed different things. Carl paused, waiting for someone to finish coughing. I think each of us brings our own background and experiences to what we read, and so we find different favorite characters. Mrs. Garter, who was still standing next to Carl, walked around her desk to sit down. If I hadn't already been seated, I'd have done the same. Carl was in control. Everyone feels for Stanley. That one is a no-brainer. He didn't pause, stumble, or stutter. But when we wanted to explain how we related to some of the other characters, especially the ones not as easily likable. It's funny how I thought his voice was rough the first time I heard him. And now it sounded fine. Each person in our group wanted to speak about who they liked, so we decided to take turns telling you why. Then we can open it up to discussion. I turned and returned Jessica's dirty look. I gestured to Ari. Next time, I didn't dare kick Jack's chair. He put his yellow index cards back in his pocket. He hadn't looked at them once. He separated the purple ones, and a tall, red-headed kid with freckles took them from him. He had arms longer than necessary and was unsure where to put his hands. Finally, he kept one on the cards and one thumb hooked to the front pocket of his jeans. So my favorite character was like Madame Zeroni. I thought she was super smart and should have gotten more playtime in the book. I don't believe she really placed a curse on Stanley's family, but I like how she made Stanley's great-great-grandfather carry a piglet every day up the mountain. I think it was smart of her because as the pig grew bigger, Stanley's great-great-grandfather grew stronger carrying it. He grew stronger without realizing it. Making someone get better without them realizing it is pretty cool. I guess that's all. 3 long steps and he was back in his chair. Carl moved the pink index cards to the front of the stack. One of those girls who always traveled in a group stood up. I had trouble telling them apart. They wore the same clothes, down to the tennis shoes, spoke using the same words and inflection, and ended up looking exactly the same. She was smacking her gums so hard it was difficult to pay attention to what she said. Brilliant, I thought. Maybe I'd try that next time. I think Mr. Pendanski, one of the camp counselors, was a great character. He seemed like he genuinely cared about the kids at the camp. Smack, smack. The kids even called him Mom. Smack, smack. But he didn't care about the kids any more than the other counselors. I think that was even worse than being mean because the kids trusted him and he let them down. But I also liked how sneakily evil that was. Yeah, so that's all I really wanted to say. She took a little bow, at which point her friends all giggled. Mrs. Garter pointed to the trash can, and she spat her gum out before sitting down. The last person in their group got up, and Carl handed her the white index cards. She looked serious, like she was about to tell us why we had only 1 month to live. Zero is my favorite, she said. I think everyone underrated him. He was the best friend out of all of them, the fastest digger, the bravest, and even the smartest. But nobody would know it. I like how he did what needed to be done without bragging or talking about it. She turned around to look at Carl, who nodded for her to go on. I think it was a good lesson to remember that sometimes actions speak louder than words. It's easy to believe what someone tells you, but sometimes it takes longer to believe in someone when they don't. She gave Carl a high five and went back to her seat. I looked at Carl. She could have been speaking about him. He was the zero to my Stanley.